I think it's really important to look at the powers of Congress to truly understand the legislative branch. Let's look at some objectives today. By the end of this video, I'd love for you to describe 4 types of powers delegated to Congress. I'd also like you to compare and contrast shared and exclusive powers, explain the necessary and proper clause, which we'll find in the Constitution, compare and contrast strict construction versus liberal construction, and what non-legislative powers does the Constitution delegate to Congress? While we're watching this video, I'd love for you to think of Oliver Ellsworth's quote. As a founding father and 3rd Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he stated, "The powers of Congress must be defined, but their means must be adequate to the purposes of their Constitution. It is possible there may be abuses and misapplications. Still, it is better to hazard something than to hazard at all." What do you think? Congress has powers delegated or given to it by the Constitution. Congress has many powers to do many things. Congress has inherent powers. They're not listed in the Constitution, but these are powers that all sovereign nations possess. Explicitly written in the Constitution in specific wording, the express powers are delegated to Congress as well. By reasonable deduction from the express powers, we also have implied powers. And lastly, even though it's the legislative branch's duty to create laws, they also have some non-legislative powers. These are powers that don't necessarily have to do with making a law. Throughout this video, we're going to go in depth with each type of power. Most of the powers that Congress as a whole exercise or is allowed to exercise because of the Constitution, most of those powers are shared between both chambers. In other words, what the House can do in terms of power, the Senate can also do. There are some what we call exclusive powers. In other words, those are powers that only one of the 2 chambers is allowed to exercise per the Constitution. I want to give you an example. If you were to draw a Venn diagram, you would have those 2 circles that overlap. When it comes to the powers of Congress in comparing the bulk of shared versus exclusive powers, that middle section is actually the largest. That would give you space to list the shared powers, and then you'd only need that outer sliver on the outside of both circles to write in the exclusive powers of Congress. As you watch this video, keep in mind most powers are shared. If they are exclusive, I'll make sure to point that out. The legislative branch possesses inherent powers of government. These powers, like the implied powers, are not explicitly listed in the Constitution, but they are said to be inherent to the very idea of national government. Because the U.S. is a sovereign nation in the world, it can be assumed to possess certain powers that all sovereign nations possess and always have possessed. The Founding Fathers, the argument goes, surely took for granted that the U.S. government would have these inherent powers as well. These powers exist in essence simply because the U.S. exists. There are not many of these inherent powers, but some are quite important. They include the power to control the country's borders, to give or refuse diplomatic recognition to other countries, to acquire new territories for national expansion, and to defend the government from revolutions. If we were to put inherent powers in our Venn diagram, it would definitely fall under the shared category. Let's talk about express powers. These are the powers of Congress that are specifically spelled out in the Constitution. They're also called enumerated powers. Same thing, enumerate just means to list by number. If you want to follow me, go ahead and open up a copy of the Constitution to Article 1, Section 8. These are the powers that the Founding Fathers said Congress needs to do this. 27 express powers of Congress are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The most important powers include the power to tax, to borrow money, to regulate commerce and currency, to declare war, and to raise armies and maintain the Navy. These powers give Congress the authority to set policy on the most basic matters of war and peace. Again, if you go to Article 1, Section 8, you will see them. There's a list of these powers and they're pretty specific, except for the very last one. Final one out of that list is what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and that's going to lead us to our next section. But the Necessary and Proper Clause says that Congress has all those powers, but it also has the authority to do anything that's necessary and proper. Unlike the express powers, implied powers are not written in the Constitution, because they're just that, they're implied. The framers knew that they could not list all possible powers that a future Congress would need. Therefore, they conclude the list of congressional powers with a final clause, that's the Necessary and Proper Clause, that would allow Congress to take actions needed to carry out the express powers. Let's look at some examples. Congress has the express power to lay and collect taxes. That implies that they have the power to punish tax evaders. Congress has the express power to raise armies and navies, and that implies they have the power to draft Americans into the military. Congress has the express power to regulate commerce. That implies the power to establish a minimum wage, ban discrimination in workplaces, regulate banking, and so forth. Now, the Necessary and Proper Clause has stirred controversy. How should these words, and by implication the Constitution itself, be interpreted? On one side of the issue, strict constructionists argue that Congress should exercise only those powers clearly granted to it in the Constitution. In the early days of the Republic, strict constructionists were known as anti-federalists because they wanted to preserve power for the states as much as possible. Loose constructionists, known as federalists, wanted Congress to have freedom to act vigorously. If something were necessary and proper to the exercise of one of Congress's express power, they argued, then Congress could do it. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton led the opposing sides in the debate over what necessary and proper meant. One of their main issues was the creation of a national bank. Do you side with strict constructionists or broad constructionists? Do you think Congress should have more power or less implied powers? Congress is a legislative body. Its primary function is to make law, but the Constitution does give it some other chores, several non-legislative duties to perform as well. Article 5 says that Congress may propose amendments to the Constitution by a 2/3 vote in each House. All 27 of the amendments thus far added to the document have been proposed by Congress. In recent years, several state legislatures have petitioned Congress for amendments. Among them, measures that would require Congress to balance the federal budget each year, prohibit flag burning, permit prayer in public schools, outlaw abortions, impose term limits on members of Congress, and prohibit same-sex marriage. The Constitution gives certain electoral duties to Congress. The House may be called on to elect a president. The 12th Amendment says that if no one receives a majority of the electoral votes for president, the House, voting by states, is to decide the issue. The Senate must choose a vice president if no candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes for that office. In that situation, the vote is by individual senators with a majority of the full Senate necessary for election. That the 25th Amendment provides for the filling of a vacancy in the vice presidency. When one occurs, the president nominates a successor, a replacement, someone to fill the vacancy, and it's subject to a majority vote in both houses of Congress. It has happened twice. Gerald Ford was confirmed as VP in 1973 and Nelson Rockefeller in 1974. The Constitution provides that the President, VP, and all civil officers of the U.S. may be removed from office on impeachment. The House has the sole power to impeach, that is, to accuse or bring charges. The Senate has the sole power to try or to judge to sit as a court in impeachment cases. Impeachment requires only a majority vote in the House. Conviction requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Chief Justice presides over the Senate when a president is to be tried. The penalty for conviction is removal from office. Presidents have been impeached by the House: Andrew Johnson in 1868 and Bill Clinton in 1998. The Senate voted to acquit both men, that is, it found them not guilty. All major appointments made by the President must be confirmed by the Senate by a majority vote. Appointment of a cabinet officer or of some other top member of the President's official family is rarely rejected by the Senate. The Senate has only rejected 12 of more than 600 cabinet appointments. The President makes treaties, but he also has to seek the advice and consent of the Senate. He needs 2/3 of the Senate present to agree or concur with him. For a time after the adoption of the Constitution, the President asked the advice of the Senate when a treaty was being negotiated and prepared. Now the President most often consults a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Senate may accept or reject a treaty as it stands, or it may decide to offer amendments, reservations, or understandings to it. Congress has the power to investigate, to inquire into or inform itself on any matter that falls within the scope of its law-making authority. Like the other powers, this authority is implied by the Constitution's grant of the legislative power to Congress in Article 1, Section 1. Both the House and the Senate exercise that power through the standing committees and their subcommittees, and often through special committees as well. This concludes Powers of Congress. I have a few things I'd like you to think about. I want you to identify 3 different types of congressional power and a few non-legislative powers. Does Congress use its power too much or not enough? And how should the government balance strict constructionist viewpoints and broad constructionist viewpoints? Lastly, do you agree or disagree with Oliver Ellsworth's quote? I'd love to hear from you.